All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. We pick up at letter C of number 14, and this is from page 10. So we're about 2/3 of the way through. The seller right to cancel, seller's right to cancel with the buyer contingencies. If by the time specified in this agreement, buyer does not deliver to seller, again, it's capitalized, a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement, then the seller, after first delivering to buyer a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit except for fees incurred by the buyer. So again, special definitions. What this is stating is that the buyer has the right, obviously, as long as there's a contingency period open, and as long as, certain contingencies have not been removed, that they can cancel this contract. If at the time the contingencies are supposed to be removed, the buyer hasn't done that yet, the seller first gives the buyer a notice to buyer to perform. If the buyer does not remove that contingency or answer that document, they then have the right to cancel the agreement, and they must return the buyer's deposit. All right, number 2, seller's right to cancel buyer contract obligations. So this is different than the contingencies. The seller, after first delivering to buyer a notice to buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement if, by the time specified in this agreement, buyer does not take the following actions: deposit funds as required, so that increased deposit in order to satisfy the obligations of the contract, or if the funds deposited pursuant to paragraph 3D1 or 2 are not good when deposited, so bad check, which is of course averted now with the wiring being the default method of transfer. Number 2, deliver updated contact information for the buyer's lender. So if they should happen to change lenders, or if the lender can't be reached at contact information that the seller has, that's actually an obligation now under this contract, so that the buyer has to make sure that that information is updated and sent over to the sellers. Number 3, deliver a notice of FHA or VA costs or terms, if any, as specified by paragraph 5C4 in the RR. Deliver verification or a satisfactory verification if seller reasonably disapproves of the verification already provided as required by paragraph 5B or 6A. That's talking about the loan approval. If the seller, for some reason, thinks that it's a shady loan or whatever, the buyer is now contractually obligated to prove to them that this is really a viable loan that they're getting. Deliver a letter as required by 6B in writing, assume or accept liens or leases specified in paragraph 8G. That, of course, is talking about any security systems or solar panels or satellite dishes or anything that has some type of a lease attached to it. That also is a reason for the seller to be able to go ahead and cancel this contract if the buyer doesn't accept those and get everything switched into their names and payment information taken care of. Return statutory and other disclosures as required by paragraph 11F. So if the seller has given the buyer everything, but the buyer isn't returning that stuff, that's another reason for the seller to go ahead and cancel this contract. Number 8, cooperate with the title company's effort to comply with the GTO. We talked about that yesterday. GTO being the geographic targeting. They're trying to make sure that if the people are paying cash for the house and it's over $300,000, that they have complied with that targeting order. And sign or initial a separate liquidated damages form for an increased deposit as required by paragraph 5A2 and 29. Or number 10, provide evidence of authority to sign in representative capacity as specified in paragraph 28. So that's again, someone who is signing for the buyers in a legal capacity. Or number 11, perform any additional buyer contractual obligations included in this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of the buyer's deposit, except for fees allocated to the seller in this agreement and already paid by escrow prior to cancellation of this agreement and notification to escrow. So that's really important to make that distinction. If the buyer in number 1 is if the seller is going to cancel based on the buyer's contingencies, they haven't removed all their contingencies, they've done an NBP, buyer hasn't answered that or hasn't removed those contingencies, now the seller is ready to go ahead and cancel, they must authorize the return of the buyer's deposit, except for fees incurred by the buyer. So if the buyer has paid for inspections or reports or anything like that, that money is due back to the buyer. I'm sorry, those fees are considered paid and an expense of the buyer. The seller will return the deposit, but those fees are just considered spent. It's money spent. But if the seller is canceling because of the buyer's contractual obligations not, excuse me, not being met, now they have to authorize the return of the deposit, except for any expenses that the seller has incurred. So usually termite inspections, maybe HOA documents, the CC&Rs and all that type of thing. All of those expenses can be withheld from the buyer's deposit when it's contractual. The buyer's contractual obligations haven't been met, seller is going to cancel. Now they're allowed to keep that money for the expenses they incurred. Let's see. Johan, you want to read number 3?
Yes. Seller right to cancel. Seller contingencies. Seller may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any seller contingency included in this agreement or otherwise agreed, so long as the contingency has not already been removed or waived in writing.
Yes, and again, because we are seeing contingencies being removed in the actual agreement, that's when this would come into effect. You can't remove contingencies when you write the offer and then expect to be able to cancel because of one of those contingencies throughout the escrow period. So this is, remember, these are seller contingencies. So we have seller's rights to cancel. This is all under the seller right to cancel. For buyer contingencies, buyer contractual obligations, and now the seller's contingencies. So if the seller, what would be one typical contingency that the seller might have? It's the number one objection that we're getting with sellers, just traditional sellers. Exactly, where are they going? So they will have a contingency that they have to find their replacement property. If they can't meet that obligation, that's now a reason for them to go ahead and cancel. So again, it's a delicate walk that we're walking with both buyers and sellers right now. It's a very unique and interesting market. Okay, let's go on to the buyer's right to cancel. Number 1, Ralph?
Buyer right to cancel seller contingencies. If by the time specified in this agreement, seller does not deliver to buyer a removal of the applicable contingency or cancellation of this agreement, then buyer, after first delivering to seller a notice to seller to perform Form NSP may cancel this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for fees allocated to seller in the agreement and already paid by escrow prior to cancellation of this agreement and notification to escrow.
Yes. So if the seller hasn't found their replacement property, they release the deposit and can only keep any fees that have already been paid by escrow. Okay, buyer's right to cancel seller contract obligations. If by the time specified, seller has not delivered any items specified in paragraph 3N1, so all those disclosures, reports, all the stuff that the seller is contractually obligated to deliver to the buyer, or seller has not performed any seller contractual obligation included in this agreement by the time specified, the buyer, after first delivering an NSP, may cancel this agreement. Okay, so those are the seller's contract obligations. The buyer's right to cancel buyer contingencies. The buyer may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any buyer contingency included in paragraph 8 or otherwise agreed, so long as that contingency has not already been removed in writing. So this is where you definitely want to keep some contingency open, you know, right up to that 17th day and possibly even longer if those documents weren't delivered in a timely manner, because they need some way out just in case, you know, that's you protecting your buyer.
So for example, my case, if at the end of the escrow, the tenant doesn't move out, then we can use this D2 to cancel.
Probably not at the end of escrow unless you make it a contingency of the sale or of the purchase. So if you write in there in the other terms that a contingency for the tenant to vacate the premises extends beyond the contingency period or something like that, we can look and see how we should word that exactly, but you would need to make it a part of the document. You'd want to make sure that it's in there so that, you know, on day 26, if the tenant is not vacating, or, you know, I think we talked about 45-day escrow. So if day 40, they haven't vacated, you know, you've got a serious problem. And hopefully it's being monitored before that and you're being proactive and dealing with it much earlier than that. But it is definitely going to be a delicate situation. So you want to be real careful.
Yeah, because they say the tenant will move out January 1st, so I need to put that in our counter offer.
Absolutely. Yes. Memorialize that. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, you know, you could also make that you are saying the tenant is going to move out. This is now part of that contract, you know. Buyer reserves the right to cancel if the tenant is not out by January 1st, because you'll have exceeded your contingency period by then.
Okay.
So yeah, we
Yep.
can talk about that after. Yes,
The other day you mentioned cash for keys. About what is the typical amount that you offer somebody?
there really is no typical amount. It can be anything from, usually the least amount is 1 month of their rent or mortgage payment. So maybe like 2,500 all the way up to, I did a couple of cash for keys for banks back in the day, and we gave $25,000 to the owners to vacate, as long as they left the property in habitable condition. They didn't, you know, destroy the place. And that was kind of the purpose behind cash for keys, trying to mitigate the buyers destroying the place because they felt, you know, jilted by the banks and whatever.
Okay.
All right. So that takes care of the sellers and buyers' rights to cancel. Now we're going to talk about this wonderful thing called the notice to buyer or seller to perform. Like I said in the very beginning, I definitely see more of these documents going back and forth. And up until now, they have been a last resort usually. They are definitely negatively accepted by the other party. And so we haven't been very proactive with talking about them up front. So in the buyer training, the buyer consultation training, in our second meeting with them, when we're, or maybe not in the second meeting, but the actual second consultation, where now we're writing offers and we're talking about the escrow period and the whole process. We're going to lay everything out for them. This is where you're going to talk about these notice to buyers to perform and notice to sellers to perform. It's a document that we can use to get the other side to do what they contractually agreed to. And that also goes for us. So if we receive one of these, it means that we haven't done, or it could be just a reminder that we need to, perform one of the obligations of the contract. Yeah, let's read this because the time frame has changed. So, Johan, you want to read the notice to buyer or seller to perform?
The notice to buyer to perform or notice to seller to perform shall 1. Be in writing, 2. Be signed by the applicable buyer or seller, and 3. Give the other party at least 2 days after delivery or until the time specified in the applicable paragraph, whichever occurs last, to take the applicable action. A notice to buyer to perform or notice to seller to perform may not be delivered any earlier than 2 days prior to the scheduled performance day to remove a contingency or cancel this agreement or meet an obligation specified in paragraph 14. Whether or not the scheduled performance day falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, if a notice to buyer to perform or notice to seller to perform is incorrectly delivered or specifies a time less than the agreed time, the notice shall be deemed invalid or void, and seller or buyer shall be required to deliver a new notice to buyers to perform or notice to seller to perform with a specified time frame.
Yeah, so like I said, we're going to see more of them, but they better be written exactly as they're supposed to and delivered in a timely manner. So they can only give it 2 days prior to the scheduled performance day. Again, scheduled performance day is capitalized, so we know it has a special meaning. And this is going to tie into what is a countable day and what is a calendar day. So remembering that escrow is closed on the weekends and holidays, we can't ask for something that would be affected by escrow to happen. You can't serve it on Friday, making that day 0. Saturday would be day 1 and Sunday would be day 2 because escrow isn't open until Monday. So you couldn't give it any sooner than that Saturday. So that's day 0. Sunday would be day 1. Monday would be day 2. Okay. And so if you receive, as the buyer's agent, if you receive a notice to buyer to perform and there is an inaccuracy, they aren't giving you the proper time, it's considered invalid and void, and your buyer doesn't even need to worry about it. But if it is within, all of those parameters, then yes, they do need to take the appropriate action. All right, effective removal of contingencies. Ralph, removal of buyer contingencies?
If buyer removes any contingency or cancellation rights, unless otherwise agreed, buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have, one, completed all buyer investigations and review of reports and other applicable information and disclosures pertaining to that contingency or cancellation right. Two, elected to proceed with the transaction, and three, assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for the non-delivery of any reports, disclosures, or information outside of seller's control, and for any repairs or corrections pertaining to that contingency or cancellation right, or for the inability to obtain financing.
Okay, so this is really important. The buyer, if the buyer removes those contingencies, it's now understood that they have completed any investigation, any inspection, any, contractors that they wanted to have come in and give them estimations, anything whatsoever. And they've reviewed all of those reports, all of the disclosures, all of the applicable information, and have made a decision to cancel or to remove those contingencies. That is also passively saying that they agree to proceed with this transaction, and there is no justification for them to now cancel the contract. So this is a really, really big deal. It shouldn't be done lightly. It does have to be done within the time frames allotted by the contract, but that's why we have to be proactive and get everything done as early in the transaction as possible, so that we know when day 17 comes along, the buyers can remove all contingencies. They know they're buying this house, and everything can move forward smoothly towards the close of escrow. Removal of seller's contingencies. Johan?
If seller removes any contingency or cancellation rights, unless otherwise agreed, seller shall conclusively be deemed to have satisfied themselves regarding such contingency, elected to proceed with the transaction, and three, given up any right to cancel this agreement based on such contingency.
Again, so, obviously the number one contingency being the finding of their replacement property. Once they remove that contingency, it's a done deal. So they can't back out of the transaction because that escrow falls apart, or, for whatever reason, they don't have their backup, their replacement property. Okay, demand to close escrow. Before buyer or seller may cancel this agreement.
Sorry?
Yeah?
Yeah, so I have a question.
Yes.
So if the seller's contingency is for them to find a replacement property, is there a time frame for this?
Usually, well, not usually. It can be anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months that they would have that contingency. Just like you might see a COP, the contingency that is the contingency of purchase. There might also be the contingency for the buyers to sell their property, and that runs the length of the contract automatically. So if there's going to be a different time frame, then that needs to be called out in an addendum or a counteroffer or something like that.
So there will be a time on the COP.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. So and like 2 weeks is from acceptance or from the close of escrow?
It depends on the date of that contingency. If they say contingent on the, replacement, the finding of a replacement property, they'll have a date on there. And then that runs congruent with the contract. So if they say they need 30 days to close escrow on their new property and your property is supposed to close on 30 days, they have the right to cancel right up until day 30 because they haven't found their replacement property.
Okay.
Demand to close escrow. Before buyer or seller may cancel this agreement for failure of the other party to close escrow pursuant to this agreement, buyer or seller must first deliver to the other party a demand to close escrow, DCE. You don't use a notice to seller to perform. You don't use a notice to buyer to perform. There's a specific document called the demand to close escrow. The DCE shall be signed by the applicable buyer or seller and give the other party at least 3 days after delivery to close escrow. A DCE may not be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the scheduled performance day for the close of escrow. So again, we might see these coming across our desk, even though everything has been moving very quickly, very smoothly. The parties are getting along, everything's great. We can still see this DCE come in 3 days prior to the day that we're supposed to close escrow if the seller so chooses to do so, or if the buyer so chooses to do so. If a DCE is incorrectly delivered or specifies a time less than the agreed time, the DCE shall be deemed invalid and void, and seller or buyer shall be required to deliver a new DCE. So same as the buyer to perform, notice to buyer to perform, notice seller to perform. If the dates are wrong, time periods are off, it's invalid and void. Okay, effective cancellation on deposits. Ralph?
If buyer or seller gives written notice of cancellation pursuant to rights duly exercised under the terms of this agreement, the parties agree to sign and deliver mutual instructions to cancel the sale and escrow and release deposits, if any, to the party entitled to the funds.
Having a show next Saturday, but just if you're around, you're welcome to come.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Less fees?
I'm sorry?
Less fees and costs paid. Line 3.
Less fees and costs paid by escrow holder on behalf of that party if required by this agreement, and any escrow cancellation fee charged to that party. Fees and costs may be payable to service providers and vendors for services and products provided during escrow. A release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from the party's judicial decision, arbitration, award. A party may be subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000 for refusal to sign cancellation instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to which party is entitled to the deposited funds. Civil Code 1057-3. Note: neither agents nor escrow holder are qualified to provide any opinion on whether either party has acted in good faith or which party is entitled to the deposited funds. Buyer and seller are advised to seek the advice of a qualified California real estate attorney regarding this matter.
Yes, and again, it's bolded, highlighted. Make sure that you know not to give your opinion about whether your buyer will get all of their money back or not. There have been so many lawsuits where that was the advice of their agent, and the buyers ended up taking their own agent to court because they gave that opinion. So they ask about their deposit, how much of my deposit am I going to lose? How much am I going to get back? Talk to an attorney. My lips are sealed. I'm not saying anything because you really don't know, that good faith, it's spirit of the law, what constitutes in good faith. We don't really know. That's for an attorney to figure out. All right, repairs. Johan.
Repairs shall be completed prior to final verification of condition unless otherwise agreed. Repairs to be performed at seller's expense may be performed by seller or through others, provided that the work complies with applicable law, including government permit, inspection, and approval requirements. Repairs shall be performed in a good, skillful manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to existing materials. Buyer acknowledge that exact restoration of appearance or cosmetic items following all repairs may not be possible. Seller shall 1. Obtain invoices and paid receipt for repairs performed by others. 2. Prepare a written statement indicating the repairs performed by seller and the dates of such repairs. And 3. Provide copies of invoice and paid receipts and statements to buyer prior to final verification of condition.
Yes, so all repairs must be done before that final walkthrough. Okay, so even if it's, remember now per the contract, they have to take down any brackets that are holding TVs. That's probably number one. That has to be done. And remember, they have to patch the hole, but they do not have to paint. So that might be something where, you know, it's going to look different because the living room is maybe a taupish colored paint, but the repair is going to be a big white spot. That's actually all that the seller is contractually obligated to do. So, you know, knowing that and letting the buyers know that this is what we can expect to see. Obviously, some sellers are just going to be very nice and you know, it's a matter of pride for them that they go ahead and paint it. And so that's just an added bonus. But if they don't, the minimum contractual obligation is to patch that hole and leave it. Unless, of course, your buyers want that left there. And then that's something, again, you have to call it out in the contract that you want it included because it's excluded from the contract. It's supposed to be repaired, removed and repaired. Okay. Final verification of condition. Buyers shall have the right to make a final verification of the property condition within the time specified in paragraph 3J, not as a contingency of the sale, but solely to confirm that the property is maintained pursuant to paragraph 7B, repairs have been completed as agreed, and the seller has complied with seller's other obligations under this agreement. So it is not a reason to cancel because contingencies have all been removed already anyway, but it could be potentially, like I said, I had a property where we went for the final walkthrough and all the copper pipe is gone from the walls. There's huge holes in the walls because they pulled out all the copper pipe. It wasn't necessarily done by the seller. Someone broke into the property and removed it all because it was a vacant property. So that now, you know, we had to negotiate who's going to pay for this. How are we going to deal with this? Because it is not a contingency of the sale, but obviously the property isn't in the same condition as the day that the seller or the buyers saw it and made the offer. Prorations of property taxes and other items. Ralph?
Unless otherwise agreed, the following items shall be paid current and prorated between buyer and seller as of close of escrow: real property taxes and assessments, interest, seller rental payments, HOA regular assessments due prior to close of escrow, premiums on insurance assumed by buyer, payments on bonds and assessments assumed by buyer, and payments on Mello-Roos and other special assessment district bonds and assessments that are now a lien. Seller shall pay any HOA special or emergency assessments due prior to close of escrow. The following items shall be assumed by buyer without credit toward the purchase price prorated payments on Melrose and other special assessment district bonds and assessment and HOA special or emergency assessments that are due after close of escrow. Property will be paid as follows. One, for periods after close of escrow by buyer, and two, for periods prior to close of escrow by seller. CCAR Form SPT or SBSA for further information. Seller agrees all service fees, maintenance costs, and utility bills will be paid current up and through the date of close of escrow. Tax bills and utility bills issued after close of escrow shall be handled directly between buyer and seller. Proration shall be made based on a 30-day month.
Yes, so this is where escrow, works their magic. They're the ones that do all of that, which is why we give sellers and buyer an estimated closing cost sheet, because until escrow actually closes, we don't know the exact amount of the taxes that are due on the seller, because they have to pay through the day of the close of escrow. And then the buyer is responsible for day one, the day after the close of escrow and beyond. And the same for utilities and any lease payments for solar panels or security, whatever. All of that stuff is, it's date dependent. So we have to, some of that has to be handled outside of escrow. Any utility bills, obviously you're going to communicate with your buyers, make sure in the buyer's checklist, it tells them, make sure you talk to the utilities and give them your estimates, and then of the day of close of escrow. And if that does change, then obviously they need to make a phone call and say, hey, we're actually extending escrow. I don't need the utilities in my name until, February 14th or whatever it is. Okay.
The escrow amount in the loan, in the mortgage, that just goes back to the seller?
The escrow amount in the mortgage.
Yeah, they pay your taxes.
Oh, if they have an impound account?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yep, they take care of all of that. They will debit the account for the amount earned and credit the seller back for what's not earned. Good question. Okay, brokers and agents. Compensation. Johan?
Seller or buyer or both as applicable agree to pay compensation to broker as specified in a separate written agreement between broker and the seller or buyer. Compensation is payable upon close of escrow, or if escrow does not close as otherwise specified in the agreement between broker and the seller or buyer.
Yes, I love that they called this out. This is exactly why we want to use a buyer broker agreement. If it closes, then obviously, yes, we're going to get paid. But if escrow doesn't close, if we have materially, contractually, fulfilled our obligation, but it doesn't close, that's not really our fault. It's out of our hands. It's out of our control. So if you have that buyer broker agreement and it was written correctly, you are still entitled to your commission. And so this is, I love that they called this out. Again, I think now, hopefully we will start seeing even more people using the buyer broker agreement, and, agents getting paid, like Steve's deal that he was talking about. It's supposed to close tomorrow. He's been in escrow for months. It's new construction. And yeah, I realize, they're trying to keep the deal together and all of that. But if that doesn't happen, he's still earned that money. It's like going to work for a company and on day 13 of a biweekly pay period, they say, I'm sorry, we decided to close the company. Well, that doesn't mean that you haven't earned the money that you've already that you should have been paid. So
So where does the commission come from?
through the buyer broker agreement, you would state that, well, number one, it's covered in your agency agreement. And we are going to go through those documents as well. As long as you have materially, met all of the obligations of the contract and it was of no wrongdoing of yourself, then you deserve to be paid. So, but in the buyer broker agreement, you specify that, or it is specified that the buyer will purchase real estate, that you will represent them, that you will be paid by the proceeds from the sale of the property. And if not, then there's an area where you write in or blank, because obviously we use them with commercial deals, and a lot of commercial deals that are off the market, they don't have any commission written in. You have to put in a buyer's fee. So that's how that's handled. Okay, the scope of duty. This helps clarify exactly what they're talking about in letter A. So Ralph, you want to read this?
Buyer and seller acknowledge and agree that agent does not decide what price buyer should pay or seller should accept, does not guarantee the condition of the property, does not guarantee the performance, adequacy, or completeness of inspections, services, products, or repairs provided or made by seller or others, does not have an obligation to conduct an inspection of common areas or areas off the side of the property, shall not be responsible for identifying defects on the property in common areas or offsite unless such defects are visibly observable by an inspection or reasonably accessible areas of the property or are known to agent, shall not be responsible for inspecting public records or events concerning the title or use of property, shall not be responsible for identifying the location of boundary lines or other items affecting title, shall not be responsible for verifying square footage, representations of others, or information contained in investigation reports, market value of the property, or any personal property included in the sale, shall not be responsible for providing legal or tax advice regarding any aspect of a transaction entered into by buyer or seller, and shall not be responsible for providing other advice or information that exceeds the knowledge, education, and experience required to perform real estate licensed activity. Buyer and seller agree to seek legal, tax, insurance, title, and other desired assistance from appropriate professionals.
Yes. So none of those reasons are reasons for us not to get paid, because we're not supposed to be doing it. So if you give your buyers the information where they can go to verify the square footage of the property, that's all that you are obligated to do, is just give them the contact information. And you're really not even obligated to give them that information. You tell them what they need to do. You need to contact the county or the records, Department of Public Records, or whatever, the Department of Building and Safety, or whichever. You don't even have the obligation to do that. But of course, because we are helpful and trying to provide the best service for our clients, we do that. But you are not giving them any advice as far as how to deal with those people, what questions to ask, or anything like that. None of these responsibilities are on us. The scope of our duty, we are a fiduciary, we are, negotiating and facilitating a real estate transaction. Joint escrow instructions to the escrow holder. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's talking about, this contract is we call it the RPA, but it's really the California Residential Purchase Agreement and joint escrow instructions. So this is just stating that escrow is going to contact both sides. We have to make sure that they have all the proper information for both sides, and that they will facilitate this sale as a disinterested third party. Okay. Yeah, 3 days. The 3 days, again, bolded here. Those HOA documents, the seller needs to pay and order those HOA documents within 3 days of the delivery of the acceptance of this offer. So that one is a big, that is a change. And the reason that they did it, as we've talked before, you know, the HOA company doesn't really have any skin in the game of this sale. So they can say, you know, it's going to take a week, it's going to take 10 days. The person who is responsible for that is on vacation, yada, yada. So as long as the seller is putting that effort in and saying within 3 days, getting the ball rolling, then HOAs have been put on notice that they have to help and comply with this. Because otherwise it makes them look bad too. The last thing they want is for a brand new owner to move in and be against the HOA, because then they're going to come to the meetings and start raising Cain. Let's read letter C. Johan?
Agents are not
A
safe.
copy of this. No, this
A
one.
copy of this agreement, including any counteroffers and addenda, shall be delivered to escrow holder within 3 days after acceptance. Buyer and seller authorize escrow holder to accept and rely on copies and signatures as defined in this agreement as originals to open escrow and for other purpose of escrow. The validity of this agreement is between buyer and seller is not affected by whether or when escrow holder signs this agreement. Escrow holder shall provide seller's statement of information to title company when received from seller. If a separate company is providing title insurance, if seller delivered affidavit to escrow holder to satisfy seller's FIRPTA obligation until under paragraph 11H. Escrow holder shall deliver to buyer's agent and seller's agent a qualified substitute statement that complies federal law. If escrow holder's qualified substitute statement does not comply with federal law, the parties instruct escrow to withhold all applicable requirement amount under paragraph 11H.
Yes, so the FERPTA, again, is just saying that the seller doesn't owe any taxes to the government, and so they sign this document saying so. That's sent over to title so that they can, you know, proceed with the seller's title policy. I also like that they called this out. Escrow does not have to sign the purchase agreement and return it to both sides in order for this to be a valid contract. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, it's still a valid contract. This contract is between the buyer and seller. Doesn't matter if escrow actually signs it or not. Okay. Letter D, Ralph?
Agents are not a party to the escrow except for the sole purpose of receiving compensation pursuant to paragraph 18A and paragraph C of real estate brokerage section. If a copy of the separate compensation agreements provided for or in either of those paragraphs is deposited with escrow holder by agent, escrow holder shall accept such agreements and pay out from buyers or sellers funds or both as applicable. The broker's compensation provided for in such agreements, buyer and seller irrevocably assigned to broker's compensation specified in paragraph 18A and irrevocably instruct escrow holder to distribute those funds to brokers at close of escrow or pursuant to any other mutually excluded cancellation agreement. Compensation instructions can be amended or revoked only with the written consent of brokers, buyer and seller shall, consent of brokers. Buyer and seller shall release and hold harmless escrow holder from any liability resulting from escrow holder's payment to broker of compensation pursuant to this agreement.
Yes. All right. Any questions about that? Again, agents are not a party to this contract. We're only the ones getting paid to facilitate the transaction. Okay. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the escrow holder may require invoices for expenses under this agreement. Buyer and seller, upon request by escrow holder within 3 days or within a sufficient time to close escrow, whichever is sooner, shall provide any such invoices to the escrow holder. So if something was paid for, that receipt needs to get to escrow within 3 days or within a sufficient time to close escrow so that it can be credited and debited accordingly. Upon receipt, escrow holder shall provide buyer, seller, and each agent verification of buyer's deposit of funds pursuant to paragraph 5A1 and 5A2. Once escrow holder becomes aware of any of the following, escrow holder shall immediately notify each agent. Number 1, if buyer's initial or any additional deposit or down payment is not made pursuant to this agreement, or is not good at the time of deposit with escrow holder, or if buyer and seller instruct escrow holder to cancel escrow. So if the seller calls escrow and says, hey, we got to cancel, we can't find our replacement property, escrow then has the obligation to call the buyer's agent and say, hey, sellers are canceling, they can't find a replacement property. Okay. A copy of any amendment that affects any paragraph of this agreement for which escrow holder is responsible shall be delivered to the escrow holder within 3 days after mutual execution of the amendment. So obviously, any amendment to the contract that is done between buyer agent and listing agent, that has to get over to escrow so that they can do their addenda that have to happen, and they can again, facilitate the debits and credits to buyers or sellers, or contact any outside contractors or vendors. Okay. Selection of service providers. Agents do not guarantee the performance of any vendors, service, or product providers, whether referred by agent or selected by buyer, seller, or other person. Buyer and seller may select any providers of their own choosing. This helps indemnify us. If you're obviously your buyer is going to look to you for, who should I use for my title policy? Who should I use for my lender? Who should I use for the repairs that need to be done? We want an interior designer. Who should I use? Any of those referrals that we're giving to our clients, we're indemnified from by this lovely little number 20. Okay. But again, to cover your even further, give them 2, 3, 4 choices. Tell them, talk to all of them and see which one you like the best, and it's your decision. Okay. Oh, this next one is really, really important. The MLS, the multiple listing service. Johan, you want to read this?
Mm-hmm. Agents are authorized to report to the MLS that an offer has been accepted, and upon close of escrow, the sales price and other terms of this transaction shall be provided to the MLS. to be published and disseminated to persons and entities authorized to use the information on terms approved by the MLS. Buyer acknowledges that any pictures, videos, floor plans, collectively images, or other information about the property that has been or will be inputted into the MLS or internet portal, or both at the instruction of sellers or in compliance with MLS rules, will not be removed after close of escrow. California Civil Code 108A-C requires the MLS to maintain such images and information for at least 3 years, and as a result, they may be displayed or circulated on the internet, which cannot be controlled or removed by seller or agents. And 3, seller's agent, buyer's agent, and MLS have no obligation or ability to remove such images or information from the internet.
Super, super, super important. Why is this clause in here? Because lawsuits have been initiated over this exact information. The buyers are happy, you know, they close escrow, they're super excited about their new home, and then they call up their agent and say, I want all the pictures taken off. I don't want people seeing the inside of my house. Sorry. For up to 3 years, that information is public information. That listing was in the MLS. There's nothing we can do about that. So I like that they called that out in here.
Why do they need to keep all that, the pictures and stuff?
Because it's used for appraisals, and we use it for our CMAs that we do. Does it have to be 3 years? No. 1 year would be plenty long, but they're just stating that it could be on there for at least 3 years. The MLS is going to keep that information on there for 3 years. I know it's been really helpful for me when I have, maybe I have a buyer who is looking for properties, and I'll go in and, you know, they give me their specifics, and I'll go into a neighborhood, and if I look at past sales, I can see the layout, and I can then say, yes, okay, this would be a neighborhood that would fit what you need. You know, they're centrally located to these 3 schools or whatever it is. So those pictures and the information in the MLS is very helpful, and we don't want that disappearing just because escrow is closed.
Yeah, I mean, 6 months, a year to me would be fine. You know, 3 years is, but you know, I guess it is what it is. It's not worth saying anything about it.
Nope, there is nothing we can do. All right, attorney fees and costs. If in any action, proceeding, or arbitration between the buyer and seller arising out of this agreement, the prevailing buyer or seller shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees and costs from the non-prevailing buyer or seller, except as provided in paragraph 30A. So this says, you know, if they do go into arbitration, mediation, anything else, the party that wins is also entitled to their attorney costs being covered, except as provided in paragraph 30A, which we will come to. All right. I am going to stop there because assignments, as we talked about in the very, very beginning with, you know, the legal parties to a contract, assignments is a very special beast. We don't see them super commonly in the real estate that we do, but in the wholesale part, we will definitely see lots of assignments. So we will talk about that tomorrow. All right, any questions?
Nope.
All right, I will see you later. Have a great day.
All right, you too.
Hey.
Bye.